In addition to passing the Build Back Better, Senator Schumer will also look to pass pieces of legislation dealing with voting rights. In order for these bills to pass, they would need at least 60 votes in the Senate, meaning that at least 10 Republicans would need to get on board. This is something that's unlikely to happen, being that Republicans find these bills unnecessary. Democrats believe that requiring an ID to vote is racist, being that minorities may be less likely to hold an ID. Republicans say if you need an ID to purchase alcohol or cigarettes, then it shouldn't be too much to ask for an ID when you're at the voting booth. Here's Republican Senator Ted Cruz making his case why these voting rights bills are simply nonsense.
I want to start with a question for each of the 5 witnesses. In your judgment, are voter ID laws racist?
Thank you for that question. So it depends. One thing we have to stop doing is treating all voter ID laws as the same.
Okay, so your answer, I want to move quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay, so you think the entire state of Texas is racist. What about requiring an ID to vote is racist?
So I think, sir, that's pretty reductive. I'm not saying the entire state of Texas is racist.
You just said my state of Texas, so you tell me, what about the Texas voter ID laws is racist?
So the fact that the voter ID law was put into place to diminish the political power of Latinos with racist intent and had been found to have
You're
racist
asserting
intent,
that. What's your evidence for that?
The federal district court that first resolved the constitutionality of Texas's voter ID law.
Okay, so your view is voter ID laws are racist. Mr. Van Spakovsky.
No, particularly because every single state that has passed an ID law has put in a provision to provide a free ID to anyone who doesn't have one. The turnout numbers show it has no effect, and I would remind everyone that the current version of the Texas voter ID law for in-person voting, the Obama administration agreed in court, in a court filing, that they were satisfied with it and that it was not discriminatory.
You know, I have to say this is the wildly partisan nature of the Democrats' proposal. The record should reflect all 3 of the Democratic witnesses invited by the chairman maintained to this committee that voter ID laws can be, in many instances, in most instances, I think of the various ways they formulated, are racist. So let me tell you who disagrees with that. 35 states across the country disagree with that because 35 states have voter ID laws in effect. But not just 35 states. 81% of voters in America disagree with the radical views proposed by the Democrats and the Democratic witnesses. Not just 81% of Americans. 77% of black voters in America support voter ID laws. 78% of Hispanic voters in America support voter ID laws. Maldev should think about that. 81% of low-income Americans support voter ID laws. And yet, what this bill is about is putting radicals in charge of saying, if you require an ID to vote, that is racist and must be struck down. This is all about partisan power. Now, and I've got to say, there is a view, particularly from Northeastern Democrats, that they look down on the rest of the country as a bunch of bigots and overalls, their Southern cousins who are too oafish to be as enlightened as they are. And I have to say there's an incredible hypocrisy in that states like Georgia and Mississippi have a higher black voter registration rate than states like Connecticut, the chairman's home state. They have higher black voter turnout rates than states like Connecticut. They have a lower gap between black and white turnout than in states like Senator Blumenthal's Connecticut. And in fact, states like Georgia and Mississippi, African Americans vote at a higher rate than white voters, and in Texas, they're basically equal. One of the sad realities of today's Democratic Party is they define race as follows. If you're a Democrat, you qualify. So under the Democratic view, I'm not Hispanic. Senator Padilla is. If you're a Democrat, you're an Hispanic. My abuelo and abuela would be very surprised to discover I wasn't Hispanic. But that's how Democrat views it. That's how the radicals in the civil rights division view it. And I will point out as an example, this committee, one federal district judge in the state of Texas, Jason Pulliam, is an African-American judge nominated by President Trump, sat at this table, presented superbly. The Democrats had no criticism, and every single Democrat on this committee voted against him. Why? Because they perceived him as a black Republican. He didn't qualify as a black man. The Democrats were voting against Judge Pulliam. Do you have one basis to vote against him? Anything you disagree with? None of them had any single answer at all. This hearing's about one thing. It's about power, and it's about ensuring Democrats stay in power. That's cynical, and it's at the expense of democracy and the right of voters to express their will through free and fair elections.
As I mentioned, being that it's unlikely 10 Republicans will vote in favor of these voting right bills, Democrats will need to find another way to pass it. One way to do this would be to get rid of the filibuster, which would mean no longer needing 60 votes in the Senate in order to pass pieces of legislation such as this one. Once again though, both Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are opposed to getting rid of the filibuster, so Democrats face yet another roadblock. President Biden recently said that he would be in favor of a filibuster carve-out if it meant the difference between voting rights laws passing or possibly not passing. If you enjoyed the content in today's video, make sure to give it a like and leave a relevant comment below. Thank you so much, and I truly hope you have a great rest of your day.